What's up? This is Miles Away. Welcome back to another video. Now, as evidenced by this wall beside me, I am an absolute pedal enthusiast. I use them on pretty much all of my Miles Away compositions and work I do for others because I feel like pedals, when done correctly, can really give you a flavor and workflow that you just can't get with a plugin. Every once in a while, a pedal comes out that is just so excellently groundbreaking and so different than something I could get inside my DAW that it's really worth talking about. And today, I truly believe we have one of those pedals, the Walrus Meraki. Now, before we get to talking about why the Meraki is such a big deal, I want to tell you a quick story first about the colorful synth behind me, the Moog Matriarch. Now, the Moog Matriarch was announced back in 2018 and released in 2019 and set the synth world on fire. Not only was it a great sounding Moog instrument, but what really drew people, including myself, to shelling out over 3,000 Canadian dollars for one was the fact that, to my knowledge, it was the first ever synth that included a stereo analog bucket brigade delay. Now, if you watch studio tours like I do, you will see the Moog Matriarch in countless professional film composers, touring electronic artists, and more studios because of this beautifully coveted stereo analog delay that really just wasn't possible to be acquired any other way. So anyway, with that context, back to what makes the Walrus Meraki so special. Well, the Walrus Meraki is, to my knowledge, the first Stompbox format dual stereo independent analog BBD delay that uses the coveted MN305 analog chips. Analog bucket brigade delay is one of the most coveted sounds in music, and while there are some excellent digital emulations, the two I'm holding up are my two personal favorites, just nothing really quite compares at this point to the real thing for a couple of reasons. Firstly, there's an absolute magic that you get with each repeat fading away with entropy and getting more and more degraded over time. Secondly, there's some real magic to my ears about the way that real analog delay causes feedback and clipping inside the pedal as the repeats build and build until self-oscillation. Now, there are already some absolutely fantastic analog BBD delays, my two favorites being these two so far, the Chase Bliss Thermae and the Fairfield Meat Mod. And while they sound absolutely incredible and have that charm real analog delay only can have, they're mono pedals, meaning that everything you play through them will go straight through the middle. The Walrus Meraki, on the other hand, is the first, to my knowledge, true stereo BBD delay using these absolutely coveted MN305 chips. So with the Meraki, you're essentially getting this incredibly rich analog sound multiplied by 2 and then put together in one pedal with independent controls for each side. That is truly special. So if this is such a coveted sound, then why haven't more people made a stereo analog BBD pedal? Well, I actually had the opportunity to chat with lead engineer on this project, Ezra Jernigan, and he was able to explain a bit about the immense challenges and difficulty that it took to create this pedal. Ezra mentioned that the biggest challenge with creating a stereo analog delay pedal was getting it to work properly and not be extremely noisy to the point of being unusable. In order to get the pedal to sound as good as they wanted without excessive noise while running at 30 volts with clean headroom, they had to do a lot of trial and error and filtering to get rid of clock noise. Not only that, but not all delay chips are created equal. Walrus made the choice to use the expensive and coveted MN305 BBD chip because of its high headroom and low noise. The Meraki has 8 MN305 chips inside it, which is a big reason for its extremely high cost. Another thing that was extremely important to Walrus was keeping every single part of the signal path in this pedal fully analog. So not only do you get an analog filter, which is in the shape of a tilt EQ, to brighten up the sound and create really amazing high fidelity repeats or really beautiful low dreamy repeats, but you get an analog LFO, analog bypass, and more. There's even a built-in analog clipping section so that if you overdrive the pedal by running the input way too hot, instead of damaging the chips or getting an unwanted digital noise, you get beautiful analog distortion. But anyways, that's enough talking. Let's jump to a demo song I made where every single time-based effect you hear is the Walrus Meraki. If you dig this demo song and you've enjoyed the video so far, please make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and let's check it out. All right, well, hopefully you enjoyed that demo song, and hopefully it showed you just how inspiring and unique the character of this stereo analog delay is. All right, next up, let's learn how the Meraki works by going through each of its controls. Now, something worth noting is that you cannot save presets on the Meraki because it's a fully analog circuit. You can, however, clock it to MIDI and use several of the features as MIDI CC controls, as I showed in the demo song, but bear in mind, if you want a delay with lots of presets, this is not going to be it. Okay, let's check it out. All right, well, here we are on the front panel of the Walrus Meraki, the amazing stereo analog delay. Now, typically I like to use really beautiful, fully developed sounds, but for today, I'm gonna use an incredibly simple sound that sounds like this. It's just a triangle wave going through a filter with a little bit of envelope. Now, let's enable the Meraki. And right away, we hear an absolutely beautiful cascading stereo sound. Now, this is pretty much just the stock sound that you'll get right out of the box with everything at noon. But what I wanted to highlight before we zoom in and move into the specific controls is the Meraki is fully true stereo, which is what makes this pedal so magical. So if we disable it, we hear that my sound is a mono sound. But as we turn up stereo spread on the synth and use headphones for this, we can hear all of the notes of the synth are going across the stereo spectrum. Now, a lot of pedals, even stereo pedals, are gonna basically sum that to mono and then create stereo after, or are just mono to begin with. But as we enable the Meraki, let's listen to how each of these notes across the stereo spectrum reacts to Meraki's stereo field. It's absolutely amazing what this thing can do with these two BBD delay lines in stereo. So let's zoom in and check out the controls of the front panel. All right, so the controls of the Meraki are actually quite simple, yet surprisingly deep. So at its core, we really do have these two independent BBD delay lines. And we can start off by using them just together in parallel, like a standard delay, which sounds amazing. This is what we've been hearing so far. So we can control our time. And as you can hear, even with these really low times, we still get immaculately clean and beautiful, yet imperfect analog delay. So we can control the time here, as mentioned. We can control the feedback of each side independently. So we notice one side starts oscillating. Let's bring that down. Let's make them even for now. We can control the tone and get really nice warm repeats with this analog tilt EQ. Again, every single part of this pedal is pure analog, which is just incredible. So if you want these really murky, warm, dreamy analog repeats, go all the way to the left and we get a analog low shelf boost and low pass filter. And vice versa, if we go all the way to the right, we can really open up these chips and hear them in their full glory. Now for me, this mode is by far my absolute favorite because one of the challenges of analog delay is sometimes getting it to sit in the mix because it's so dark, and which is beautiful on its own, but sometimes you don't want that in a mix. And with the Meraki, the ability to have this beautiful analog tilt shelf filter on the high end and then a little bit of low cut really makes it sit nicely in the mix. And if you remember from the intro, the reason why they went with these expensive MN305 chips is because they're relatively low noise. So if we hear full open filter and high boost increase, and it's still relatively not too noisy, and what little noise is there just adds a ton of character. So the final knob here is absolutely my favorite, and that is our modulation knob, which is an analog low frequency oscillator, which is gonna add nice modulation to make our repeats sort of chorus and blend with each other. So if we crank it, we get that beautiful C6 sound, and without any modulation at all. Let's turn down the feedback just a little bit. Now, despite it being one knob, the mod section on this pedal I've found is incredibly deep and can drastically alter the tone you get from the pedal. So for example, let's turn it up to halfway here. And as we hold down the bypass knob, we can actually change the speed, as you can see by the red light flickering, all the way from extremely slow. Let's crank the mod so you can hear. Which will act almost as the delays just sort of like fading in and out of tune like an old synthesizer, or extremely fast if we want almost like a chorusing sound. And where it gets deep, as you can tell, there's not too much modulation happening right now, is the way the mod speed and depth interacts with the time. So for example, if we crank this up with an extremely high level of mod, we get a really, really unique sound. We can change the shapes. Sample and hold. And we start to get just really interesting chorusing sounds, right? Like for example, if I were to turn down the feedback completely and crank the mix, then all of a sudden, let's turn down the mod depth a little bit, I think here. We get a really beautiful analog vibrato actually. Turn it down. A stereo analog vibrato. Absolutely beautiful, and it's a really versatile way to use this pedal. So let's go back to using it as a delay then. We'll turn the time up, we'll turn the feedback back up. All right. And I'll turn this back to a sine wave. So the last thing about the modulation I want to show you, which is actually, I think, my favorite thing about the pedal overall, and really speaks to how deep this mod section is, surprisingly, for it being only one knob on the surface, is if we hold down bypass and flip this switch, we can actually change the phase relationship of the mod section between each side. So what that does is essentially now, if we press a note, I'm actually going to take away the stereo spread on this sound just so you guys can more clearly hear what's going on. If you can hear, it's actually put the modulation out of phase between the two sides of the delay, which is one of the most amazing effects I've ever heard. It's almost like the Haas effect, to get a little bit technical here, but for modulation rather than just the delay itself. So you get these incredibly lush, wide stereo fields. If we bring it back, we've still got the stereo delay, but now listen, with it on, at full, you can hear the modulation is working independently. So let's move on. We'll leave that as it is because it sounds fantastic. We'll turn down the mod a little bit, turn up the feedback, and let's check out the different feedback paths. So what we've been hearing so far is just our standard parallel feedback mode, but we also have everyone's favorite ping pong, which will bounce the left side to the right, then the right side to the left. And then the last mode we have here is series, which is extremely unique and essentially makes the feedback of the left side feedback into the right and the feedback of the right feedback into the left. This is really useful for creating like drones, self-oscillations, or really interesting complex rhythms. And I'm gonna show you just an example here of how powerful this pedal is as a drone synth, because frankly, it's almost like an instrument in and of itself. So let's turn up our feedback where it's right on the edge of self-oscillation. And you notice in series mode, we get this beautiful wall of noise. Incredible. And change the time. I ended up cutting there because I spent about 5 minutes just getting lost in that drone, but that just goes to show how addicting it is to lose yourself in the amazing textures of this pedal. So let's move on here. So to another really interesting part of the pedal, we have this ability, and I'm going to switch it back to our basic mode here just so you guys can hear. We have the ability to basically decide which part of the pedal we are affecting. So in sync, the time and the mod is affecting both of them at once, right? But for example, let's turn off modulation and make time really fast so it's obvious. If we switch to L here, only the left side of the pedal is going to be affected when we start to move the time. And same with the mod. What's really cool about that is you can essentially completely set fully different delays between your two sides. Let's go to the right. Change some feedback. And we have a completely unique stereo field, right? The right one is completely feedbacking at a different amount and tempo and modulation depth from the left. So really, really cool stuff there. And if you do want to use it a bit more traditionally, you can also go ahead and use classic division. So for example, we bring everything back into parallel, everything is being affected at the same time, same amount of feedback. And we can use subdivision. So we can make the left side a quarter note, the right side a dotted eighth note. So this section is extremely useful if you want to clock the pedal to MIDI, as I did in that demo track, because one of the amazing things we haven't even mentioned yet about the Meraki is that it's a fully MIDI capable pedal. Now, I know there are some parts of the pedal that you can check out in the manual that aren't MIDI controllable, but for my intents and purposes, all I really use a MIDI capable pedal for is just clocking it to my master tempo in Logic, which this works beautifully with, and then you can use the subdivisions. All right, well, that's where I'm gonna wrap up the tour of the Meraki today. Now, the elephant in the room, of course, is the price. This is probably the most expensive analog delay pedal on the market, but hopefully after learning a bit more about the sheer amount of expensive materials that are required to create this, as well as the engineering challenge, you can actually see that it's priced fairly competitively with other offerings on the market like the ones I mentioned before. Thanks so much for watching. Leave a comment what you thought of the pedal, and if you have any questions, I'll try my best to answer them. Thanks so much to Walrus for having me demo this pedal. I'm absolutely obsessed with it, and it's gonna be on every Miles Away release for the foreseeable future. Let's jump to a post-rock outro song I made highlighting the Meraki, and I will see you in the next video.